is conversation, community conversation. My name is Will K. Wilkins. I'm the director of Real Artways, and I'm here with three people and we're going to have about an hour-long conversation sparked by the film Good Trouble, John Lewis' Good Trouble, which is a documentary which you can watch right now through Real Artways. You can go to our website and watch that. And so this is, it's a little bit of an experiment for us. We haven't done this yet. So I just want to say to John and to Shelley and to Iran, thank you so much for being part of this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to introduce who our guests and then get into a conversation. And later on, we will be taking conversations from the members of the audience as well. And they'll be being relayed to us, and we'll hopefully have an opportunity to answer those questions. So I want to first say welcome to Reverend Dr. Shelley Best, who is the founder of 224 Ecospace, which is a remarkable institution and space tucked into Farmington Avenue, not too far from Etna. And it's a space that's for social enterprise and for arts. And Shelley, you refer to yourself as a creative peacemaker, which I thought is an interesting play on the creative placemaker. And just to say that Shelley, Reverend Dr. Shelley Best, is a minister in the AME Zion Church, and she has a Master of Divinity from Yale, a doctorate of ministry from the Hartford Seminary, and she's also an artist and a yogini. So Shelley, it's great to have you here with us.
Thank you.
Yeah. And Iran Nazario is founder and president of the Peace Center of Connecticut, and does a remarkable amount of work with young people who've had challenges growing up, some people who've gotten involved in gangs and are trying to find a way forward. And Iran, from his own personal experience, has understanding of people's circumstances and has a way to listen and to guide people through some real challenges. So that's part of what we're all going to be talking about today. Iran, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
And John Selders is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and is the minister of the Amistad United Church of Christ, which meets at the Hartford Seminary, and a founding member of Moral Monday, Connecticut, which is a grassroots statewide organization committed to social justice issues. John, thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you for having me.
I had the opportunity this weekend. We've been showing the film John Lewis, Good Trouble, and I wonder, John, if you could start off and just say to us, when you look at the work that you do, and you look at the work that John Lewis does, and the commitment to nonviolence and social change, when you look at your own life and what sparked you in that direction, what was it? What moved you to take the path that you've taken?
That's a very interesting question. I come from, Cornel West says it like this, I was birthed and come from a tradition. I didn't know it at the time. I just, called myself living my life and responding to the circumstances that were around me and feeling the need to respond and do something, right? Only later to stand, and to think for a moment, like, man, this is what other people do. And then to do a little bit of genealogy work and to find out that I'm third generation classically trained Pentecostal preacher. My grandfather and my grandmother, my paternal grandparents, were both preacher and musician. I'm a musician as well. And they were both social justice, community justice minded. I was born, and my grandparents' ministry was birthed in the town right next door to Ferguson. So there are lots of connections to justice-oriented work. So I would have to say that it's in my DNA. I didn't know it until I discovered it. And then to discover that I am a part of a trajectory that dates back to the before the beginnings of this country, resistance and racial justice and social justice.
Well, one of the things that I just read an interesting book by Jill Lepore about the history of the United States, and it's called These Truths. And one of the things that she emphasizes is how there are lots of things we haven't been taught, but one of the things we haven't been taught is how there has been resistance to slavery and to oppression coming from folks in the Black community for the entire history of this country. It's been there. Thank you, John. Shelley, you grew up in Torrington, Connecticut. Is that right?
Actually, Norfolk, Connecticut first, before we moved to the big city of Torrington.
Okay. And how, you know, when you refer to yourself as a peacemaker, what in your life, you know, I looked at John Lewis in his life, and at an early age, he reached out to Martin Luther King and made that connection, which was proved to be so important for him and for the country. For you, what put you in a position where you wanted to change the world for the better?
I think for me, it was growing up in a place like Norfolk, Connecticut in the 60s and 70s. It was the experience of being a Connecticut Yankee, raised in the midst of old money New England, which is a particular taste of New England. And we happened to have been the only Black family in the town. And my father grew up in Harlem, and he believed in the importance of integration. He was sold out on this whole notion of integration, and he felt that we should integrate a town. And so our family moved into a town where we were the only Black family there, an old money New England town. And so you might say, well, how was that? It was very harsh, because I learned a lot about class and race and racism, New England style, because growing up in that kind of community as the only Black family, yes, we were alienated, but I also saw the cruelty within the white community towards other white people. And so my grandmother was a very fiery woman, because it was painful a lot of times to come home from school and have the experience of the name calling and the exclusion. But my grandmother always reminded me of how some of the white people treated the poor white people in that town. And it's a strange thing, but when I started to see how they were treated, I started to defend the poor white kids who were being put to the side in that environment. I knew I was Black, and that gave me a certain kind of strength. At least I'm Black being treated this way. It's sad to see how poor white people are treated also. And so how did I become an activist in the midst of it is by showing up, by just being there was activism. So I learned what it was to be a transformational leader by just showing up. And I think that gave me strength because I learned it at a very young age, and it's always been a part of my journey. So I know what it is to walk in rooms where we are not always welcomed, where we might be the only. And I know what it is to stand there, maybe sometimes in discomfort, but actually I'm more comfortable than not to be in certain spaces now and make change happen by just showing up. So that's been my life, and it will continue to be my life.
Beautiful, thank you. Iran, tell us about your awareness of social justice and social opportunity.
Right.
How did you come in your own experience to see yourself as somebody who could make a difference?
Well, my story started out in Brooklyn, New York, traditional Latino home, and eventually I end up in Connecticut due to domestic violence my mom was going through. So I'm actually born and raised in the city of Hartford, and I didn't know anything about what was going on. I was born in 1970 and really had no clue on what it was that the social justice movement had, civil rights had, on what I was going through. All I knew is that I was part of a system where my mom was addicted to crack and cocaine, and because of that, I was kind of sent through the system and became a part of the system in a lot of ways. But I believe at this point in my life that there was something in me that wanted to do something to help other people. I knew what it was to be a victim of being smothered, of being tortured, of being tormented by my own family. But I hadn't really yet understood how the system played a role in that continuing to happen to me, even into my late teens and early 20s. So for me, my family or my bond or my community or my social structure was the street. So when I eventually started kind of traveling into the networks of gangs and street life, I still didn't know the value that I had in being able to help that society. But something in me still wanted to stop injustice. And I remember being witness to a number of crimes. When you're in that environment and you have that mindset, you believe that these crimes that we're committing and we're part of are normalized, right? They're normal. There's something that you're supposed to do because you live in that existence. But something still inside of me said to me, this is not right. Something about this is not right. So it wasn't until in my 20s, I had an opportunity to fight for an injustice that I felt was unjust to my community. St. Francis Hospital was hiring folks to start working on the new addition to St. Francis, the newer section of St. Francis. And I felt like I wanted to work there, and other folks felt like we wanted to work there, but we were convicted felons or convicted, et cetera. And we didn't get those opportunities. So something in me started working amongst my group of guys to say, why can't we get these jobs? And that was the first kind of seed that was planted into me about advocacy and standing up for your community and making sure that you had the same opportunities. So that was my first kind of seed that was planted. I actually went to my rival gang member sets and started advocating for us to have a peace treaty so we can lobby and activate to picket that site so they can hire individuals like us to work there. So I had no idea why I was doing it. I had no concept of Dr. King or didn't have John Lewis. I just knew that something wasn't right about, wait a second, we're killing each other, harming each other, going back and forth from prison. Something is not right here. So I don't know if that was the other sources in the world, other forces in the world saying, young man, you have a purpose that's different than what you're doing, but you need to start doing something. And I think that was the initial planting of the seed that propelled me into becoming what I call today as a peace healer, because I'm a wounded healer. So I'm a peace healer, and I'm involved and invested in saving as many young people in the communities as possible.
Wow, that's beautiful. John, for you, in terms of thinking about nonviolence, how did that become something? Address this to everybody. The idea of nonviolence is not. It's not necessarily something that you're born with. I don't think. I think as humans, we're kind of rough with each other. What brought you to the idea that nonviolence is an important tool for social change? And that's to Shelley, to Aran, to John, whoever wants to respond.
Well, for me, you call me first, so I'll talk first.
Okay.
Aran, I appreciate your story a bit, and I've heard a bit, and we've met before, so I know a little bit of your journey. What's interesting to me is you're an example of what I call, or what I refer to as, the moral instinct. I believe we all have a thing inside of us that is bound to ask the question, is this right or wrong? And then how we answer that, whatever the it is, and then how we address that is how our life takes us, and we navigate the journey vis-a-vis answering the questions. Some philosophers would call that the existential question. Why am I here? What's my purpose, right? I believe it is that I call it the moral instinct. And I think we're bound, all of us are bound by that. That's one part of who we are in our human condition. So that when it comes to nonviolence, for example, and we saw it lived out in all kinds of ways. I would declare that Dr. King and the modern day civil rights movement is not the beginning of nonviolence, right? Quite frankly, it was Baird Rustin that said, Martin, you better look at what Gandhi is doing over there in India and what he learned in South Africa. All right, and I would also suggest here in New England that we had people like William Monroe Trotter in Boston, and other folk, Mariah Stewart, who was born right here in Hartford, who were these activists, James Pennington, another activist of the abolitionist movement. These were folk who were engaged in what I would call justice work, who used the tools that were available to them of protest, of activism, and much like what we learned from that day into this day. It's only when turn-up occurs, that's what the kids call it. I learned that term in Ferguson, turn-up. Now I say turn-up, it creates the political space for community and social transformation to occur. It is only when we get enough turn-up, when enough people and enough voices and enough people are out in the street, there's some notion of civil unrest. Now Frederick Douglass comes to mind. The power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and never will. So it is what we've seen lived out over and over and over again that gives us at least an idea that this might work. So young people now occupying the streets who are talking about defund the police in this current Black Lives Matter moment. I think we have one, I'm smiling because I got some hope, but also that it is the trajectory of how change, at least one way, social change occurs.
I would jump in there and I would say it's almost a noble idea when we talk about nonviolence. I think people sort of get these warm feelings about the protesters being nonviolent in their approach. I look at nonviolence a different way, in that in order to stay in this work for the long haul, you've got to do some inside work. You've got to find a way to stay engaged without burning out. And the only way you can stay engaged without burning out is to operate in love. And so even though people may do some hateful things to me, even though I've experienced some very harsh forms of discrimination and racism, I still have to find a way to love that human being somehow, some way. So nonviolence is not just the activity of organizing in certain kinds of formations, it's the inside work where you can still see someone else's humanity. So what concerns me now in this generation, I see a movement happening, but I am concerned about the younger generation and its approach to the advocacy, because we need them and they've got to be able to make it for the long haul. And my concern is that often new people in activism don't have the inner fortitude to be able to make it for the long haul. And by the time someone's a really good organizer, that's when they're most at risk of burning out. And if we lose them, we lose a tremendous force in the community. So I think that it's something for us all to take a look at, how people can develop the inside structure of love, of care, of compassion, and some practices that will sustain you for the long haul. Because each one of us who have been in this work have seen great organizers burn out and not want to be involved anymore. And so we have to find ways to keep people engaged through love, through peace, through other inner practices to do the outside work.
Yeah, I think those are great points, Dr. Bess. I mean, I remember not realizing what nonviolence was. I didn't know the beauty in being able to approach something from a peaceful mindset. And to me, your strength came from how dominant you could be over someone else. So you really don't understand the value and the importance of nonviolence and how it can change. So I'll give you some examples. As soon as I started to realize the doors that began to open for me, because I was doing things differently than I had before. Every single instance where I used violence as a tool, I ended up in prison, or I ended up on the street, or I ended up homeless, or I ended up being cast aside by my community, that same community that I thought was going to back me up because I hear this guy using violence to settle his disputes. It wasn't until I started finding the power in my voice to mediate conflicts between different rivaling brothers and sisters and gangs on the streets that was suffering from other systematic issues that they didn't realize because they were so angry and so bent on using violence as the tool. This is when I started using violence the least, is when my voice started to rise the most. And it's when people stopped hearing my yelling and screaming and fussing and throwing punches and started actually seeing that I had some promise. I remember rebelling against being nonviolent because it was my tool, my mechanism to stop what you said, that deep search that you're looking for within you, to stop yourself and make yourself love yourself and not burn out. that was hard. What a process that was, because especially when someone is holding you accountable, that word accountability, I had no idea what that was. I knew that I was going to prison and serving time for what I was doing, but I wasn't seeing it as accountability. I was seeing it as punishment for what I had done, the natural projection of being what I was. But then when I started becoming nonviolent and learning about forgiveness and having to be like, wow, this is what that feels like. This is how brave you have to be to forgive someone and to use nonviolent tools to solve your issues, is when I started to excel and see the possibilities. It stopped clouding my vision. My vision was clouded by anger and violence. Nonviolence helped me see a different way of communication. And I think that that's what continues to propel me today. I have this burning fire. I always say that if I was as committed as I was to the streets, if I can just flip that on its head and just give it 50% more of that to nonviolence and peace, then there's nothing that can stop me. And I'm going to continue to move forward. So I think that that's the understanding I have about nonviolence. It gives you the opportunity to make less enemies. And don't get me wrong, there are enemies out there that are saying, wait a second, just because of what you look like and where you come from or how you sound or what your heritage is, we're not going to like you. But what I mean by that is that every time I hurt someone, every time I was violent with someone, I wasn't just gaining that enemy. I was gaining that person's mother, father, sister, brother, cousin, future son, daughter, because that's what happens. It starts to snowball into lifelong enemies who you could have as allies. And I'll give you another example quickly. I have guys and ladies who were former enemies of mine, rivals of mine in different gangs that I was in, who now, because I take this path, actually can shake my hand, can look at me and say, you know what, you're not such a bad guy. I can say to them, neither are you. We were both hurting and we were looking for solutions through violence. And by doing this, we're able to now solve our hatred for each other or our disregard for each other and look at us as real individuals. So I think that's what nonviolence has done for me, is cleared up my vision to be able to see somebody differently when they're suffering instead of seeing them through angry lenses. So that's my power. That's my power.
Yeah, I want to jump in. I want to jump back in because thank you, Shelley. You raised up something that I also have to speak about a bit. One, I think it was Jimmy Baldwin that said to be Black and relatively conscious in America is to live in a state of rage, you know, perpetually. I'm paraphrasing him. What's interesting to me when I think about what it actually takes to engage in the effort over the long haul. I mean, any of us can flame on about a thing. We can turn up about a thing, but to understand that now that flame on in the moment now is akin to a movement past the moment. It's got to come. The work then has to come from what Dr. King called a deep abiding love, right? A deep abiding love, not only for oneself, but also for one's community, for the other, and how to place that and work with that within the context of it all. I love that the root word of courage is rage, courage. Right. So using that I too didn't come from it wasn't an easy journey growing up in the town next door to Ferguson, Kinloch, which is the first African-American town chartered in the state of Missouri. Right. And there's a long history. People think that Ferguson happened, you know, as a flash in the pan. And I would suggest it took decades and decades and decades for what you saw turn up in 2014, and that birth put legs to a hashtag and made it become what we now call the Black Lives Matter movement, right? It is this idea that there is love of self, love of community, love of other that draws us. And I'll use one other, since I'm a preacher, I feel like I can be at least a little bit biblical and spiritual, right? The scripture says to us that God chooses the young because they're strong, but God also chooses the elder or the older because they know the way. What I am privileged to be now is seated in my eldership. And so most of the time I'm out there on the line, and thank God for the young people that want to, you know, there's a chant that the kids would do in Ferguson that I learned. They said, we're young, we're strong, we're gonna be out here marching all night long. And when they started that, and they start that about 11:30, 12 o'clock midnight, I'm like, Lord, God. That means that if they're gonna be out here, I got to be out here, right? That there is a sense of which, and this is happening too, by the way. So I'm not worried, as you noted. I'm not so worried because they come to us, they come talk to us, and they sit at our feet. We had the opportunity during our fast just recently on the lawn of the Capitol. There we were for hours talking with young people, telling them about the story, talking about what are the strategies. Because for me, when we're talking about the kind of work that needs to go on, we're not talking about nonviolence in some kind of mamsy-pamsy way. There is discipline with nonviolence. It is militant. Dr. King talked about it. It's militant and it is strategic, right? So it's not just, we're not just marching and yelling and screaming without a cause, without some forethought. And to have that opportunity to teach and to share and actually to broker some knowledge and information. I thank God that I have a little bit of the gray now, and I've been through a couple of these storms. I've been through a couple of these turn-ups, right? So that then we could share, and that's the beauty of what we now are engaged in. It is multi-generational. It is multi-disciplined. It is happening in multiple locations, not just here in the United States and locally in Bridgeport or Hartford or New Haven or Waterbury. It's happening globally in Rio de Janeiro, in Jerusalem, in Cape Town, in London. It's happening all over the globe. I have friends who are doing work in New Zealand, right? We're connecting with them. They're turned up in Prague, right? And so we're in dialogue in a global context. Thank God for the technology that's given us this opportunity to do the kind of work and to do the kind of sharing across the globe.
I want to add to that also what I'm starting to see, because by virtue of being a minister, there are all kinds of additional practices that people are taking on now. I'm a part of an international group of people of color who meditate. And so we were in meditation on Tuesday evening, people from all over the world, many of whom are activists, tapping into the power of Buddhist meditation as another source for the work that we are doing in community. And also I want to share that when it comes to the experience of the Black church, it is a different form of Christianity, and it is a source, it is deep in the well, and it is what has sustained us for generations. And that's part of what you see in John Lewis. His strength is not something that we don't understand. We understand it very well because we see who he is and we know how he was formed, and what he did, what he stood for, how he journeyed had a lot to do with his sustaining faith. And that's what a lot of people don't understand about us. It's not just a physical personification, it's deep in the spiritual well. And that's what keeps us in this change-making work. You gotta have some roots in the well in order to stay in this thing.
You know, it's interesting that one of the most amazing lessons I learned from March, from watching his story and learning so much about him, was the resiliency of not just him, but of his spirit. Just think about in his story, and fascinating to me how even at a young age, when he would preach to the chickens in the hen house, and that was his first congregation, right? He sat there and he said they would sit and they would stare at him, but they wouldn't say amen, which I found to be really, really funny. But what I'm saying is that there are individuals that are born with this certain sense of love and compassion, and he was. I think that I don't know, and again, looking back, you don't know, but I don't know how he would have turned out had he not also been born with that innate feeling of compassion, because he told the story of when his father would have to sell the chickens to eat, or when they would have to kill them, and he would avoid having dinner anytime they used the chickens that he raised. So it's a certain level of compassion that you have to run away from your parents, especially when they believed in spanking, right? When you're willing to absorb that at an early age, He stood for what he believed in. That's my chicken. You're killing my chicken. I'm not going to be here. He was willing to take the punishment in order to make a point that he stand for something. So there are individuals that coach the right way, right? And back to the point made earlier about the concern about this new wave of advocacy and this new wave of marching and protesting, that we need that leadership. We need that guide. I'm constantly looking for my local leadership, national leadership, but it's also going to take individuals who have that inherent internal compassion to teach love, like Dr. Beth said, to individuals who are super angry, rightfully so, super angry. But how do you channel that anger into love and transfer that into action so we don't lose you to a crime? Because one of the things that I will never advocate for is, I'm so angry because I did this in the past, that I'm going to hit any person that's not of my color or doesn't support what I do. Because what you're doing, essentially, there's still a land of laws, right, that we have to abide by. So if they catch you on video, it may not surface today, but if you injure someone, guess what we just lost? We just lost you to a system that's going to wrap you up for a while. I know personally, because I was wrapped in it for many, many years. And by the time we recover, we've lost a voice that we needed out there, that we needed not only in one phase of the battle, but in every phase of the battle. Because what they did to us in the past during slavery and all of that, they smothered so much potential and so many voices that could have maybe lessened the burden on Dr. King, maybe lessened the burden on John Lewis, but those voices were smothered, and we cannot smother our own voices. So I think that this is a moment in time where we have such a galvanization, especially due to globalization of movements and people being able to talk on a dime. I could send a message to any part of the world and somebody will see it. Think about the power that exists in that. There's danger in it as well. But think about what the movement has in, how many voices are being heard. If we can bottle that and get our 10 talking points, what are our 10 asks that we want from society moving forward to help us change some of the systemic issues that are hurting. Just today I learned briefly, in Mississippi, there's still a Jim Crow law that allows for the campaign, a campaign that's run for any office there. If you win the popular vote, and you're of African American descent or other a different color or a different nationality, there's a law that says that it can be sent to the district for them to vote, even if you won the popular vote. That was a law that was enacted back then to prevent African Americans from making it. Even if there was a greater number of people that appreciated you, wanted you in office, they can vote you out based on this law. So they're looking to amend that law, make it so it's no longer on the books. But just think about what it's going to take and what it's taken so long for that law to be changed. So there's a lot of work, and you talk about the consistency, the effort of young people to not burn out. But we definitely need to figure out how we spin this rage and this anger and this hopelessness and this sense of loss into people who are going to focus on those little nuggets, those little laws, those little pieces of legislation, that if we focus too much on the president and we focus on his challenger and we don't look at these little nuggets that we have waiting for us, we're going to lose many more years of action, many more years of possibility.
One of the things that I wonder about is how, I understand the idea of addressing anger for people who are grieved through poor treatment. I don't think I understand how, from a nonviolent perspective, you deal with the hateful anger, how one would deal with the hateful anger coming from somebody who's overtly and virulently racist. How do you take this idea of love and apply it in a situation or towards people who are so clearly angry and racist? How do you do
I think we have to start with ourselves. It starts with ourselves, because that anger and hatred that you might be inclined to feel towards the other is something that starts to eat you away. And so as we're trying to stay in it for the long haul, we have to be able to occupy space without letting that kind of thing consume us. It's not easy. It's the challenge of trying to find something redeemable in that human being, which is not easy. I'm looking at some things in Washington that concern me and grieve me. And it's hard to find something redeemable, but it is the only way we can operate, because we don't want things to consume and destroy us, because then what good are we if that thing has gotten to us? The only way Black people have survived in America in this hateful, very hateful climate that we exist in on a daily basis, we've got to draw on some kind of love and compassion on a daily basis, because the microaggressions we face every single day, we cannot be torn up by hate every day. We wouldn't make it.
Oh, that's what a great point. I can tell you that, you know, I've been doing my studies on understanding as many sides of the argument as possible. So I've been watching more debates than I thought I would ever watch in my life, because I want to be able to have some sense of understanding. One of our peace heroes here at the Peace Center of Connecticut 2 years ago is a former white supremacist who was responsible for one of the most graphic murders of a Sikh family in Wisconsin, and him and the victim's son created a bond together, and they worked it out, and they created their own organization to talk about removing hate. And I had a really deep conversation with this person, Arnold Michaelis, and he and I had it out. He talked about, you know, you're a former gang member. He said, yeah, you're a former white supremacist, and we talked heavy for 2 hours. And what I got to understand from him is that his lessons started from when he was really young. He was almost birthed into a sense of hatred and lack of understanding. And now he has that space, as you mentioned, Dr. Best, that he's allowing to be occupied, because he's got challenges from people who are still avid followers of the white supremacist movement that say you're a sellout, how could you? So he has to have that space open in his heart to be able to absorb that. It is not easy, because it is something that you have to find within deep in yourself to say, is this worth it? I use the balance scale, right? Everything I do is based on balance. So I say to myself, in the grand picture, in everything that I have to live with love and be present for, does this person's anger really measure on my scale? And it never does. It's never enough. It is never enough for me to give them that space. Now, I can still say my opinion. I can still say, this is how I feel, and I'm sorry you feel that way, and I can walk away. I have tools in my arsenal. That's what we have to do. We have to be able to develop not only the patience, tolerance, and the space for them to occupy in us, but we also have to develop tools and be witty and smart when to know when to walk away, what to say, and to stand our ground when we need to. And I think that those are some of the remedies that John Lewis had, Dr. King had, and others that I've learned from watching this, but also in my own career, my own path, because that kind of hatred doesn't just come from the most hateful person. It can come from a system. I remember when I was making my transition, there were law enforcement officers that didn't believe I had changed. So they would never trust me. They would turn their backs on me. They would do whatever it was to smear me, and whatever the case might be. But I persisted because I had a different purpose. And I think Dr. Best said it best. I created a space where that could be occupied, and I can do something with it to continue to fuel my passion. It actually fuels my fire to keep going.
You know, one of the things that this conversation is making me think about, again, I don't make any bones and I make no apologies. I sure enough am a Black preacher. And part of the lessons I've learned come out of scripture. A Christian scripture says, the tools, the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. That's King James Version. That's the only one I really know how to quote, King James Version of the Bible. But the principle is that our tools have to be otherworldly, transcendent in effect. So this idea of meditation, this idea of prayer, what happens, Lord have mercy, what happens when Black people start singing? We start singing and stomping and clapping our hands. There's a thing that happens That 45. If you notice in the modern day civil rights movement, they didn't do major work outside on the street until they had the community mass meeting, and it was a whole lot of preaching, a whole lot of singing, and a whole lot of clapping going on to get fortified. You see it with ball teams right now. They huddle up and they get ready to go. They chant, they jump, they carry on, and then they go out to play the game. Right? It is what you do to fortify oneself. And I would agree that it takes something on the inside. That then works up to and then pours out to the outside. If we are, and we are in this for the long haul, right? In the movie, it was very interesting to me, and I chuckled and giggled. The struggle that the OGs had with Kwame Ture, he was there, Stokely Carmichael, and Black Power. It's the same struggle that I saw represented in the Black Lives Matter movement. When we start talking about Black Lives Matter, when we came back here to Connecticut and started More Money Connecticut, More Money CT, there was hardly any of my colleagues that would join me. Now I find it funny, I chuckle now, 6 years later. Everybody's Black Lives Matter, you know, everybody, they got it now. I was at a recent event with some brothers and sisters, and it tickled me because they didn't, you know, while they were saying it, they didn't have the right inflection on it. You could tell it was new. It was a kind of new thing. You know, Black Lives Matter. I said, move out the way. Let the young people have it. They know how to say it. But what I'm clear about is that the struggle that we have, that was represented in the movie, is still a dynamic that we've got to work with. We've got to do a little teaching, do a little sharing, do a little struggling. We might do a little arguing. We might not agree the first time around in the conversation. But what I am hopeful of, and what I'm deeply inspired at this point today, is that the tradition continues. That the struggle is made live anew. That while there is God awful stuff that continues to occur, there's a new generation of folk who are coming into the movement, who are coming into, they now call it, they're getting woke. They and now it's not just to be woke, but to stay woke, right? That they're understanding that there's a sense in which they have to sustain this wokeness. Well, man, when you start thinking that way, then you start thinking about how do I conserve energy? How do I say yes to some things and no to other things? How do I be strategic? How do I turn up and show up with power and force here? How do I lay back in the cut and wait for my time here? See, that's all about strategy. That's all about how can I be the best that I can be. Shelley and I talk a lot, we've talked often over the years, and so we have a thing. She was like, okay, what can I do on my end? Okay, while you doing what you're doing on your end, and we're working in concert with one another. Just because I'm not showing up on the people are not showing up on the line, doesn't necessarily mean that they're not involved in the work. We all have different roles and play different part in the work. So I'm as tickled as I could be right now because of what we saw demonstrated in the movie. It's happening right now. We didn't see history, but we were watching history, but we were also watching a man who lived in that history, also live in this history, right? And he bringing himself into this full space. He was in reflection. It was great to see him say, man, I was there. I've never seen this footage before. That was powerful to me, right? So that I think we're also too, and now, everybody got a cell phone, everybody got a camera on that cell phone, they taking pictures, stuff. I saw us at a recent rally, somebody sent me some pictures of a rally we participated in. I was like, boy, I wasn't as gray as I am now in those pictures. So we're getting, I had a moment that I reflected about in the same way that John Lewis reflected. And his idea that there is, his mother saying, don't get in trouble, boy, right? And he said, I had to get in trouble because I had to do something, say something, right? But it was good trouble. It was necessary trouble. Well, I think that's what we're talking about now. We're talking about how and in what way can we find a way, forge a way for ourselves, answering that internal question. Why am I here, and what am I going to be about now? Am I going to be about the work, and in what way do I show up in the work? I would be remiss, one more little piece. I would be remiss if I didn't say that the work that we're now in is led by Black queer women. It is not led by Black male preachers. And I think, some of my colleagues are feeling some type of way about it, right? But that's okay. They can feel some type of way. The work is being carried on and being led. In Ferguson, we were running in behind these sisters who were powerful and brilliant and smart. And I was hanging on for dear life, right? And in the same way across this country, these young Black and brown and largely queer women are leading this effort and leading this movement.
We've got some questions from the audience coming in, and folks, you can submit questions. And here's one. It says, I believe nonviolence can be militant and can cause change. My question is, how do we sustain this movement and prevent it from becoming co-opted by forces that actually make a living on keeping our communities downtrodden?
Well, that's an interesting point, because again, as I mentioned earlier, I've been watching so many of these debates. And in the world that we live in right now, it's almost impossible to not find someone that can sabotage something, because all you have to do is drop one message online and it can change your narrative and it spins out of control, right? That's a whole new battle that you have to weigh on whether or not you take on that battle or what. So I think the best way to do this is to start looking for your local leadership. I think if you try to take on the entire picture, you take on every single effort that you see, you'll become easily overwhelmed. So I think you need to identify who locally can help you start piece by piece kind of moving the agenda towards where you want to, what in the areas or in the direction that you want to be involved in. Because there are going to be people out there that are going to be agitators. There are going to be people that are going to, again, sabotage the movement or try to discredit something like they have done to us personally. All three of us can attest to that. But I think it's about you doing research and finding the credible human beings that are out there doing the work, and have a conversation with them and check in to see if it jives with what you want to do and what you want to represent. That would be my advice. That's what I do. I see something, I don't generally buy just what I hear in a video. I do my research. I call that person if I can get in touch with them, and I identify where they are so I can help me better understand what their true purpose is. It takes work, but if you think about Mr. Lewis and all the work that he had to do, right? It's worth it, and it's something that you should really rely on doing.
I appreciated what Bishop Selders talked about when he was lifting up the queer women that have been really organizing and making the movement happen. What we see in this new generation is they are not co-opting the movement in the way that the old heads and the old guard has. Unfortunately, a lot of the company men who have been operating in leadership in our community are used to getting paid off. And so the agenda gets co-opted by people trying to get a nonprofit grant. And so what we're seeing now with the movement is some independence, some agency, some sustainability, where people are not being paid off in the way that historically that has happened over and over again. And so I think part of the answer is people have to take this movement on with some agency, where you're doing this work and you're not looking for the quick handout from the same system that's oppressing you. That will make a big difference. The other thing is people have to start doing the inner work, because deep down inside, the impact of institutional racism and systematic racism over the years causes people to have some wounds that they've got to address and heal. Because it is a new day, we're going to have to take on new opportunities, and we're going to have to let go of some of the baggage that we've been carrying also. you know, when we look at the impact of racism and oppression over the generations, we've got to get well to walk into the new day. And so that's some of the work that we also have to do. So we can yell and protest for change, but we got to be ready to walk in the door. And I think that's part of the work that we need to do as a community, so we'll be ready to live well as we move forward. And it's going to take a whole new mindset. You don't realize that you have had an enshackled mind from the experience of living in this system for so long. So the co-opting also is because we can be easily paid off because we've had so little. And so we really have to do the inner work so we don't get taken off track by the same old agendas that have always taken us off track.
What was really crazy cool for me to witness with my own eyes, with my nieces and nephews in Ferguson. That first off, I knew what they were struggling against. I knew the pall that sits on the whole region of greater St. Louis area. It is, if you don't know anything about the Dred Scott decision and the story of Dred and Harriet Scott and their struggle for freedom, and ultimately their case going to the Supreme Court, and the Dred Scott decision of 1857 that said in Chief Justice Roger Taney's a majority decision, he writes about it. He says that Black people don't have any right to laws that white people are bound to respect. Many would say it was that decision and that court case that ultimately helped push us to the edge, and the Civil War that began just a few years later. Now, that pall sits in St. Louis. Dred and Harriet Scott lived in St. Louis. Missouri was an enslaved state, and it came into the Union as an enslaved state, as well as Maine up here in New England came in as a free state to balance the states, if you will, as this country emerged and we were pushing toward manifest destiny in this country. The reason I raised that is what I saw in Ferguson is that we had young people who had gotten sick and tired of being sick and tired, if Fannie Lou Hamer, a generation 2 ago, who said that. And they went to Twitter and they went to Facebook. The movie, we wouldn't have ever known about Ferguson if it had not been for the ingenious use of technology that these young people did themselves, right? They carved out a sense of, here's the message, here's what we're here for, here's what we're doing, and we're going to tell our own story. We're not going to wait for CNN or MSNBC. They came later, right? I heard about it because I went to Twitter and Black Twitter and said, what's going on down there, right? I got a text that said, from a buddy of mine that said, the crib is on fire, right? It is, in my opinion, the co-option, they've watched co-option. These young people have seen it firsthand and secondhand. They're third generation of a kind of co-optivity, right? And so they said, no, we're not doing it that way. And they don't even care about, they don't have to wait for stories to be told or people giving them permission. They snatch the baton. They are actually moving and working strategically. They organize and they have comms teams, communication teams, right? That they understand that they've got to craft the narrative because they've got to make their case and their point while they're out here protesting. Again, I have a whole lot of hope. I have a whole lot of trust in the young people who are on the ground now, who are working day for day, who are thinking militantly, so that they're not no chumps, right? But they're also thinking in a disciplined way, and they're also thinking strategically. My concern is that they don't hold the line with discipline. Discipline means time in, right? Mm-hmm. You gotta work discipline. You gotta stay on discipline. You gotta stay on message and stay on point. And if I had a concern, that would be the concern. But that co-op, not so much. And of course,
but I just have to put in, they were co-opted in many instances. It wasn't white leadership, it was Black leadership right. that they were co-opted by. That's the movement right. was co-opted by Black leadership. And need us not forget, Martin Luther King was not popular in his day. He was not welcomed in most Black churches. So come on now, they love Martin Luther King now, but he was not loved in his day because he was a rabble rouser and rocking the boat. So
Yeah,
very clearly this idea.
He split his own denomination. They don't talk about that. And I often say, if as many people marched on the Edmund Pettus Bridge that says they marched on the bridge
bridge would have gone in the water.
It would have fell down. You know, so I do understand historically. What I was really referencing is this moment now where young people are not waiting for somebody else to tell them. They're not waiting on somebody else to give them permission to do. They are actually in conversation with and figuring out what we need to do for ourselves. How do we need to tell our story ourselves? What do we need? I worked with some young gang members back in the day, a few years ago, who were working around Puerto Rican independence. Mm-hmm. Yep. And part of the work that they were doing, now they were doing some shady. There was some shady going on. There was some street organizing and vending going on. However, while I say that, they were also thinking about how do we create freedom and liberation for our folk, right? Every drug dealer, most drug dealers that I know, let me just be clear, in full disclosure, most drug dealers that I know they know that their gig is short-lived. And what they're really trying to do is buy their baby mama needs some Pampers, and big mama and them need their lights paid, and somebody need a car, right? So they hustling, they slinging, but they got other things other than the bling that they may be benefiting from. They also have other obligations and other commitments that they are also, most of them that I know. Now, I don't know everyone, but the ones I know, the Pookies and Ray Rays I know, they're not in it just for themselves. They're in it for some kind of benefit for the community and the family and the peoples.
We've got about 5 more minutes to go in this discussion, and I wonder if we could take these last 5 minutes to respond to one of the things that John Lewis says in the movie. And he says, one of my greatest fears is one day we wake up and our democracy is gone. Do you share that fear?
I do not. I think that, I've heard, and again, watching enough, and even tonight, I've heard about the hope that exists for the movement that we're seeing right now. Just think about the risks that young people are taking and others, and from all walks of life during COVID, to be out there during rain, assaults, repeated abuse and injustice from different law enforcement officials, etc. And they're not giving up, and that in itself is part of the democracy that I saw him fight for that right for us to have those voices, right? For young people to be able to congregate and rally and protest is part of the democracy. Now, I know that special interests, and again, we don't have enough time to get into all of that, but what I can tell you is that even the importance of pop culture and what young people are doing, using pop culture to get their voices out, that's part of our democracy as well. So I don't see it disappearing. Of anything, I think it's been lit up. Like as the young people say, it is lit, and I think that we have a level of energy that I can't remember in my lifetime ever seeing. And mind you, I wasn't as involved as I am today, obviously, but it feels different. And he said that, John Lewis, it's funny because he mentioned that it feels different, and it felt different after they were assaulted on the bridge. It felt different. It started moving the needle, and I think that's the same sentiment that I share now. It feels different.
And see, for me, I would say I do have concerns about democracy being lost, because I believe I've been living in the myth of democracy, and many things are starting to become uncovered now, especially in this administration, where my ideas about how things worked, the idea of the Senate and the Congress working, the idea that the truth would come out, the idea that there is justice, the idea that right will prevail. Many of these ideas that I was raised on, I'm seeing right now that they all can be thrown away in the hands of one man. when we take a look at how this current president is operating, he is operating outside the reins of democracy, the one that we are raised to believe, and we don't quite know what to do with somebody like this in office. There's even been some talk that after November, if he doesn't win, he's not going to leave the House, and then what's going to happen? And so I say all that to say, there are concerns about democracy being lost with voter suppression. It isn't really operating the way it should. The popular vote is not what prevails in the United States of America. It's this convoluted system that's operating. So we think it's democracy, just like many people thought Christopher Columbus discovered America. He did not discover America. So we were living with a myth with that as well. And I think we're living in a myth of democracy, and we're going to have to do the work to reclaim democracy, the true democracy, for the sake of the United States of America, because I see how it is being swept away in the hands of a few. We know special interests reign, we know money reigns, we know it's not one vote and one person. So we really have to start to uncover some of the ideas that we have, that we hold true, clean it up, and make them a reality.
Well, y'all give me a half a minute to say all of what I need to say. I'm gonna try to get it done right here very quickly. I too would agree with Dr. Best that I am very concerned about what we think is democracy that isn't, right? I do agree it is an illusion. It's a lie. We live in a democratic republic, right? It is a representative democratic republic. It is an experiment. And in fact, we don't know if the experiment is working or not working because of special interests, because of money. And of course, it's always been there. The founding fathers were all the wealthy white dudes, right? Come on. So let's be clear. It's always been around. It's been this vacation about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. These are all kind of highfalutin ideals. What I am hopeful of is that we would wake up a bit and understand that there is power in people. Saul Alinsky said there are two kinds of power, organized money and organized people. Well, I ain't got a whole lot of money, but I do have some influence with some people. And so I'm gonna work my organization, if you will, to register that we have now the opportunity to vote our case. If it was important enough for the founding fathers to legislate in our founding documents that Black people were 3/5 human, they didn't believe that by a long shot. They were having babies all over the place with Black women and Black peoples, right? They believed that it was the power of their vote and their numbers that would, in fact, that hooked up with this electoral college craziness, right? This convoluted sense of how we create, the vote was really what is the lie and the myth. And once we start telling the truth, I'm out there saying, Puka and Ray Ray, you gotta vote. Man, you gotta vote, because if it was important enough for the founding fathers to declassify you a human being, then it ought to be, and that we revisit the right for Black people to vote, with the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, and then we revisited it again almost 100 years later with the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and then we gutted out 60 years later, the strength of it, then we got something that actually, if Black people and brown people and other people of color, if we would come together and vote, we'd vote all those jokers out of there. And then we'd be free to then create our own society with not yesterday's values, but today's values, right? And that's the conversation I want to have. That's the conversation that Black Lives Matter has reintroduced to us in a broad way, in a global context. Defund the police is a conversation about taking what we know as policing and flipping it on its head. What might it mean if the way we live, the way people live in suburban Connecticut was also the way they lived here in urban Connecticut? Let's have a conversation about it.
It sounds to me like we need more than an hour, and we need more conversations. I want to say thank you very much, Reverend Dr. Best. Thank you very much. Bishop Selders, thank you very much. Baron Nazario, thank you very much for being here with Real Artways. People can still see everybody who's listening and watching. Thank you very much for being part of this. Very much appreciate you taking the time, very much appreciate the work that you do. And we look forward to what's going to come next. Thanks very much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.